World War II was the biggest war in human history, and the Eastern Front, where the Soviets and Germans duked it out, was hands down the most brutal and savage theater of operations. You had these massive tank formations, like rivers of steel, infantry swarming forward in huge charges, and artillery just booming across the snowy plains. On this front, Soviet soldiers weren't just up against the fierce German offensive, they were also battling starvation, which was often tougher than enemy bullets. Back in the winter of '41, a lot of Soviet troops might only get a bowl of watery gruel and a chunk of dark, hard bread, sometimes even mixed with sawdust, for their entire daily ration. But then, later in the war, those same guys could score a can of meat stew when they were resting up, and even get a taste of sweet American condensed milk. That kind of stark difference, all within just a few years, showed not only how Soviet agriculture was bouncing back, but also how the military might of the Soviets and Germans shifted back and forth during World War II. In this video, we're going to talk about what Soviet soldiers ate in World War II, checking out how regular Soviet troops kept their strength up during those grueling years, how their chow went from barely anything to gradually getting better, and how they ultimately pushed all the way to Berlin. The Soviet army was huge, and behind it, the whole nation's food production system and logistical capabilities were its backbone. Before we dig into Soviet rations during World War II, we got to understand the agricultural situation in the USSR back then. Before the war kicked off in the 1930s, Soviet agricultural production went through some seriously wild times. Starting in '29, Stalin pushed for agricultural collectivization, aiming to consolidate scattered small-scale farms into collective farms and state-owned enterprises. This whole process was brutal, marked by massive grain requisitions, forced measures, and political campaigns to wipe out the kulaks, which led to a severe food crisis in the early 1930s. The Ukrainian Holodomor in '32 to '33 in particular directly caused millions to starve to death, and farm output plummeted. However, as collectivization stabilized and the USSR got through that painful period of agricultural transformation, production started shooting up by the late 1930s. According to stats from back then, by 1937, total grain output in the Soviet Union had not only recovered but surpassed pre-collectivization levels, with staple crops like wheat, rye, and oats seeing significant boosts. Out in the Soviet countryside, potatoes were like the second main food source, grown pretty much everywhere, and their yield kept climbing year after year in the late 30s. These crops provided a stable primary food source for the military. Besides grain, meat and dairy production also saw some improvement in the later stages of agricultural collectivization. While per capita meat consumption for regular folks was limited, the state prioritized supplying the army and urban workers, making sure these groups had their basic nutritional needs covered. In other words, the average farmer might not eat meat often, but Red Army soldiers definitely had a steady supply in their mess kits.
On the policy front, the Soviets adopted a state monopoly system for purchasing and distributing goods. That meant the grain produced on collective farms wasn't freely distributed by the farmers themselves. Instead, the state bought it at fixed prices and then divvied it up among the military, factories, and urban residents. This system wasn't fair to the farmers, but it was a huge boon for the army. Even in years with bad harvests, the state could guarantee the military got its rations first. This highlights a key point. Soviet agricultural policy wasn't about meeting market demand, it was driven by national strategy. The military, heavy industry, and urban workers were top priority, with farmers coming in last. This distribution logic laid the groundwork for the USSR to keep its large army fed, at least basically, when the war first broke out. Numbers-wise, in 1940, the year before the Soviet-German war kicked off, Soviet grain production hit 95.6 million tons, and potato output was 76.1 million tons. Based on the food supply situation at the time, this was totally enough to meet the army's needs. At the same time, the USSR was actively stockpiling strategic supplies. Germany had already rolled over most of Europe, Poland and France had thrown in the towel, and Western European countries like Belgium, Holland, and Norway had all fallen. The whole world was under the shadow of war. Even though the Soviets and Germans had signed a non-aggression pact in '39, the Soviet government, prepping for potential war, still set up a system for food and supply reserves. Big cities and strategic spots usually had several months, even half a year's worth of food stashed away. This also provided crucial food security for the toughest phase after the war broke out in 1941. So how did all that pre-war Soviet agricultural recovery and stockpiling actually show up on the soldiers' mess tables? Well, according to the Red Army's food supply standards issued by the Soviet Defense Committee, which laid out specific rations for every branch and rank, a regular infantryman's daily allowance looks something like this. 800 grams of bread, mostly rye bread. Rye bread was a staple in the Soviet Union. It was dense and had a sour, tart taste, but it packed plenty of carbs and calories. Then there was 500 grams of potatoes, the most common side dish in the army, showing up in pretty much every meal. 150 grams of meat, the type depending on local availability. 320 grams of veggies, mainly cabbage, carrots, and onions, used for soups or stews. 170 grams of grains like buckwheat, oats, and barley, usually cooked into a porridge or gruel, simple and filling. Plus 50 grams of lard and 35 grams of sugar. This standard might have been kind of bland, but the nutritional breakdown wasn't half bad, providing soldiers with about 3,500 calories a day, which was enough to keep them going through manual labor and daily training. But here's the kicker. This was just the normal peacetime standard. Once the war kicked off, a stable supply on the soldiers' tables became super fragile.
On June 22, 1941, when the Germans went all out with Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet food reserves and logistics system took a massive hit, practically overnight. Soviet soldiers' chow then went through this wild ride, from rapidly getting worse to slowly recovering, and then getting better later on with Allied help. At the start of the Soviet-German War, the sudden German invasion cost the Soviets huge chunks of fertile agricultural land. The fall of Ukraine after the disastrous Battle of Kiev, in particular, meant the USSR lost its most crucial breadbasket and supply hub. In just a few months, the Soviets lost 40% of their grain-producing regions. Even worse, a lot of food warehouses and reserves couldn't be moved in time and fell right into German hands. In that situation, frontline Soviet rations quickly got slashed. The original 800-gram daily bread ration was cut down to 400 grams, sometimes even less. Many soldiers would only get a tiny piece of dark bread a day, plus a bowl of cabbage soup with hardly any fat in it. Meat supplies pretty much dried up, and protein had to come from small amounts of beans or wild greens. The most common complaint in soldiers' memoirs from that time was just not getting enough to eat. Some units even saw extreme cases of soldiers digging up grass roots and boiling tree bark. During the siege of Leningrad, since the city was totally surrounded, the defenders and civilians had to live on less than 200 grams of bread a day, and countless soldiers starved to death at their posts. That was a time when even the most basic survival conditions couldn't be guaranteed. Hunger, cold, filth, and chaos were just part of a soldier's everyday life. Comparing that to today, we not only get to eat well, but also keep our living spaces nice and clean. So, here's a question. How do you guys handle cleaning up your homes these days? This is where I gotta recommend the WWII V400 vacuum cleaner with its next-gen 210W interstellar suction. It'll gobble up all your trash in one pass. The roller brush, air duct, and dust cup are all tangle-free. Even the longest hair won't get wrapped around. Its long-range, wide-angle big green light makes hidden dust shadows show up 3.2 times bigger. After you're done, just gently place it on its docking station, and it'll start its dual-effect self-emptying. While it sucks up trash from both sides, it also uses a bionic mechanical scraper ring to scrape back and forth, cleaning the dust cup and filter spotless. No more worries about dust leakage, dust clouds, or traditional self-emptying not getting everything clean. The whole machine has 11 layers of high-efficiency filtration, plus a 2.5-liter antibacterial dust bag, so you don't have to empty the trash for 3 months. WWII has been #1 in self-emptying vacuums for 3 straight years and holds multiple patents. Order now and get a 30-day no-questions-asked trial, a 2-year warranty on the whole machine, and a lifetime consumables gift pack. For a vacuum, go for self-emptying, and for self-emptying, go for WWII. If you're interested, hit the link below and check it out.
The turning point for Soviet Army rations came between late 1942 and 1943. As the Soviets pulled their industrial and agricultural production lines east of the Urals, a new food supply system gradually took shape. At the same time, the Germans got hammered at the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Soviets slowly gained the upper hand strategically. During this period, Soviet ration standards started bouncing back. Bread portions went up again to 600 to 700 grams a day, and potato and grain supplies also started to stabilize. Meat was still scarce, but the army began using canned goods big time as a substitute. Soldiers could even get a little lard or broth, and that long-missed greasy feel gave them a real boost of energy. There's another cool detail from this stage. The Soviets also started taking a page from the Germans, using a ton of field kitchens, also known as mobile cookhouses. These big mobile cauldrons could whip up porridge and soup fast on the front lines, giving soldiers hot grub. Even though the ingredients were still plain, a bowl of hot porridge or a sip of hot soup could totally lift morale in freezing conditions of 20 or 30 below zero. It's worth mentioning that from 1942 on, American Lend-Lease supply started rolling into the Soviet Union. Spam, powdered milk, sugar, and chocolate gradually found their way onto Red Army soldiers' tables. While the quantities were limited, mostly going to frontline assault units, these foods felt like a gift from heaven to the soldiers. Many old vets recalled that the first time they tasted American luncheon meat, that meaty aroma stuck with them for years afterward. By this point, Soviet rations were no longer at starvation levels. At the very least, guys weren't going hungry, and they could even get hot porridge and canned goods. And when the war rolled into 1944, the Soviets had a firm grip on the strategic initiative. The Red Army launched Operation Bagration, kicking off a massive counteroffensive against the Germans. With the liberation of agricultural strongholds like Ukraine and Belarus, huge amounts of grain and livestock were brought back into the Soviet supply network. Grain output bounced back noticeably, and black bread supplies got even steadier. Some units even got to eat white bread. Farm produce also gradually became more plentiful. Cabbage, beets, carrots, potatoes, these ingredients weren't scarce anymore. The soup pots finally held more than just a few leaves floating in hot water. They were actually cooking up thick, hearty soups. Compared to the meager rations before, the Soviet Army's diet structure from 1944 to 1945 was pretty diverse. Main courses included black and white bread. Side dishes featured cabbage soup, potato stew with meat, and oatmeal. For meat, there was canned pork, canned fish, and sometimes even freshly slaughtered beef and lamb. Sweets included chocolate, sugar, and jam. As for drinks, vodka was a daily ration. Overall, Soviet soldiers' meals were pretty well-rounded, especially once the Soviets pushed into Poland, Hungary, and finally into German territory. Their chow got a serious upgrade. That's because soldiers could directly scrounge for food locally or requisition supplies. German milk, eggs, sausages, beer, and bread became common external provisions for Soviet soldiers as they advanced. A lot of Soviet soldiers tasted German sausage and beer for the first time. Some units even got to feast on whole roasted suckling pigs when they were stationed somewhere, and their eating conditions were way better than back in the Soviet homeland.
While this wasn't everyone's experience, it definitely made the chow pretty deluxe for some frontline units. This improvement in rations didn't just meet the soldiers' nutritional needs, it also gave them a huge morale boost. After all, after years of fighting tooth and nail, being able to eat some decent meals before the war ended was pretty much a symbol of victory in itself. Now let's talk about some truly unique Soviet specialty foods in the Red Army's diet. First up is kleb, which is basically rye bread, but it was totally different from the German version. Soviet kleb didn't taste great. It was sour and hard. First-timers often found it tough to swallow. But for soldiers, it had two unbeatable advantages. One, it was high-calorie. Because it was so dense, even a small piece packed a lot of energy to sustain long periods of physical exertion. Two, it was super durable. Unlike white bread, it didn't spoil easily. Kleb could last longer in damp and cold conditions, and on a front where meat and vegetables were often scarce, it was the most reliable energy source for Soviet troops. If there was nothing else, just chewing on a piece of this bread could get you through the day. In the early stages of the Soviet-German War, when food was incredibly scarce, Soviet kleb was often adulterated, mixed with wood shavings and sawdust in the rye flour. That kind of kleb was hard as a rock. You'd have to chew really hard for a long time just to get a bite down. Especially frozen kleb in winter, you could even use it as a brick for self-defense or stash it in your jacket to block bullets. But even then, Soviet soldiers treated it like gold. Whether in the trenches, on a march, or in between intense fighting, it was pretty much the only thing that could fill their stomachs. If kleb was the most common staple, then tushanka was the most popular side dish. Tushanka is a special Soviet canned meat, usually beef or pork, stewed with onions, carrots, pepper, and other seasonings, then sterilized and sealed in metal cans. It was rich in fat, high in protein and calories, and easy to transport and carry, making it a crucial ration for Soviet troops to maintain their strength during long marches and frontline combat. On the front lines, tushanka was practically a luxury. Meat was super hard to come by during the war, so canned meat was especially prized. Soldiers often mixed tushanka into their thin porridge to make a meat stew, which instantly made an ordinary meal smell amazing. Before the war, the Soviets had already churned out 450 million cans of tushanka, ready for wartime use. But once the fighting started, the Soviets totally underestimated how fast the Germans would conquer territory. Most of the canning factories and warehouses in Western Soviet Union were captured by the Germans, and all that prepped canned meat became German spoils of war, which the Germans heartily enjoyed. By 1943, Soviet canned food production had pretty much stalled due to war damage. That's when their ally, the United States, stepped up to help. Under the Lend-Lease Act, American food factories took on Soviet orders for tushanka, using Soviet recipes with American manufacturing processes to keep cranking out similar canned meat, which was continuously shipped to the frontline Soviet troops.
Throughout World War II, America produced about 2 billion cans of tushanka for the Soviet Union. Besides kleb and tushanka, the most iconic Soviet specialty, of course, had to be vodka. We all know Russians love their booze. Even in peacetime, you'd often see drunks stumbling around on the streets, let alone during wartime. Vodka is Russia's most famous liquor, usually 50 to 60 proof, though the military-issue vodka was 40 proof. This drink would give you a fiery burning sensation going down, and drinking it could temporarily numb the nerves and ease fear. Vodka had three main uses on the front lines. First, to fight the cold. In sub-zero temperatures of 30 or 40 below, a small swig of vodka could stimulate blood circulation and give you a sense of warmth. Second, for disinfection and disease prevention. With scarce supplies and unsanitary food, vodka could act as a simple disinfectant, especially helping reduce stomach issues when eating irregularly. Third, for psychological support. The tension, fear, and exhaustion on the battlefield were a huge mental test for soldiers. Vodka could temporarily relieve stress, giving soldiers a brief moment of relaxation amidst the shelling and hunger. So for Soviet soldiers, it was absolutely essential for boosting morale. In Soviet units, they might not have meat, but they couldn't go without their booze. On August 22, 1941, 2 months after the Great Patriotic War began, Stalin himself approved an order allowing frontline soldiers to receive 100 grams of vodka daily. This played a positive role in boosting the combat effectiveness of frontline units. Many Soviet soldiers would carry a bottle of vodka in their pockets for Dutch courage, chugging the rest before heading into battle. With the alcohol hitting them, their minds would go blank, and they'd charge the Germans in a hail of bullets, fearlessly, not caring about anything. Throughout the long years of World War II, vodka wasn't just a drink, it became a symbol of battlefield culture and sheer willpower, practically the Soviet soldier's spiritual ration. World War II was a clash of steel and blood. But at the end of the day, what really propped up millions of soldiers was just ordinary food. The sourness of Kleb, the greasiness of Tushonka, the fiery kick of vodka, these seemingly common tastes were inextricably woven into the blood and sweat of Soviet soldiers. The evolution of Soviet rations from dire scarcity in the early war to gradual recovery in the middle, and finally to being pretty well stocked later on, was really a microcosm of the changing situation on the World War II battlefields. The drastic drop in bread and potatoes showed just how much Soviet territory had fallen, while the arrival of American canned goods and chocolate reflected the coming of international alliances and aid. And when soldiers raised their vodka in celebration on the streets of Berlin, it wasn't just a shot of hard liquor, it was a declaration of victory. Maybe in history books, most folks remember massive battles like Stalingrad and Kursk, but for the average grunt on the front lines, their most vivid memories were often about whether they got enough to eat. War isn't just the roar of tanks and artillery, it also encompasses the everyday realities of food and sustenance. It was these simple foods, through countless brutal days and nights, that sustained the will of an army. They helped Soviet soldiers tough out the hardest times and witnessed their journey from desperation to triumph.